Long ago, in a quiet village hidden between rolling hills and endless fields of tall grass, there lived a hunter named Obi. The village itself was small, but it was full of life. Mud houses with thatched roofs formed a circle around a large open square where the villagers gathered every evening to talk, laugh, and share stories. Children ran barefoot through the dusty paths during the day, chasing chickens and playing games. Women pounded yam and large wooden mortars while singing songs that echoed through the air. And the elders sat beneath a giant baobab tree, telling ancient stories about spirits, warriors, and the secrets of the forest. But among all the villagers, Obi was known for one thing. He was the bravest hunter in the village. Obi was not the tallest man nor the strongest, but he was patient, observant, and fearless when walking through the deep forest where others were afraid to go. Every morning before the first rooster crowed, Obi would wake up quietly while the rest of the village slept. He would wash his face with cool water, sharpen the tip of his arrows, and prepare his hunting bag. His wife, Ada, often woke up as he prepared to leave. "Must you go so early again?" she would ask softly. Obi would smile. "The forest rewards those who arrive before the sun," he would reply. Then he would carry his bow over his shoulder and disappear into the darkness of the early morning. The forest surrounding the village was vast and mysterious. Many villagers believed spirits lived among the trees. Some said the forest could whisper secrets. Others believed it punished those who entered with greed in their hearts. But Obi had walked those paths since he was a young boy learning from his father. To him, the forest was not frightening. It was simply another world, a world filled with sounds, shadows, and life. On one particular morning, however, something unusual happened. The sky was covered with gray clouds when Obi entered the forest. The air felt heavy. Even the birds seemed quiet. Obi walked for hours along familiar paths. Usually, by this time, he would have already spotted an antelope or frightened a rabbit out of hiding. But that day, the forest felt strangely empty. He saw no animals, he heard no movement, only the soft rustling of leaves. Obi paused beside a large tree and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "This is strange," he muttered. He continued walking deeper into the forest. The deeper he went, the thicker the trees became. Sunlight barely reached the ground. The silence around him slowly began to feel uncomfortable. After several more hours, Obi had caught nothing. His stomach growled loudly. He had not eaten since early morning. Finally, he sighed heavily. "Perhaps today the forest has decided to keep its animals," he said to himself. Disappointed and tired, Obi decided it was time to return home. He turned around and began walking back along the narrow path toward the village. But as he passed a large ancient tree with twisted roots spreading across the ground, something unusual caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just a pale stone lying in the dirt. But as he stepped closer, he suddenly froze. It was not a stone. It was a human skull. The skull lay partly buried between the tree roots, facing upward toward the sky. Obi slowly approached it. Finding bones in the forest was not completely unusual. Sometimes hunters who got lost or travelers who disappeared were never seen again. But something about this skull felt different. Obi crouched down beside it. The empty eye sockets stared back at him like dark holes. He studied it carefully. The skull looked very old. The surface was dry and cracked from years of sun and rain. "How did you end up here?" Obi murmured quietly. The forest remained silent. For a moment, Obi felt a strange chill run down his spine. He shook his head and laughed softly. "Perhaps I have been alone in this forest for too long," he said. Then, half joking, he spoke to the skull. "Who are you?" For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, a voice answered.
It is my mouth that killed me.
Obi jumped backwards so quickly that he almost fell. His bow slipped from his hands and hit the ground. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. He stared at the skull in complete shock. Did he really hear that? Or had his tired mind imagined it? The forest around him remained quiet. Slowly, very slowly, Obi stepped closer again. His hands trembled. Did you just speak?" he whispered. The skull remained still. Obi swallowed nervously. Then he asked again, "Who killed you?" Suddenly the skull answered again, "It is the mouth that killed me." Obi's eyes widened with fear. The voice was not loud. It was calm and strange, like a whisper carried by the wind. Obi quickly looked around the forest. There was no one there. No hidden person, no trick. Just him and the skull. A talking skull. His mind struggled to understand what was happening. He had heard many strange stories from the elders of the village, stories about spirits that lived in rivers, stories about ghosts that walked at night, but never had he heard of a skull that could speak. Obi slowly crouched down again. This time he was careful, very careful. "Tell me," Obi said quietly, "how did you die?" The skull answered once more, "It is the mouth that killed me." The same words, exactly the same. Obi felt a mixture of fear and excitement. If the villagers heard about this, they would never believe him. But if he could prove it, if the king himself heard the skull speak, this could make him famous, perhaps even rich. His mind filled with thoughts of rewards and praise. Obi stood up quickly. "I must tell the others," he said. Without another word, he grabbed his bow and arrows and began running toward the village as fast as his legs could carry him. Behind him, the silent forest watched, and the skull remained where it was, resting among the twisted tree roots, waiting for what would happen next. Little did Obi know, that discovery would soon change his life forever. Even as he ran, the thought sounded unbelievable, but he knew what he had heard. The voice had been clear. "It is the mouth that killed me." The words echoed again and again inside his mind. Obi slowed down for a moment and leaned against a tree, trying to catch his breath. What kind of spirit lives in that skull, he wondered. In his village, the elders often spoke about strange things that lived deep inside the forest, spirits that guarded hidden places, ghosts of people who died long ago, voices carried by the wind. But Obi had never expected to hear such a thing with his own ears. He wiped the sweat from his face and continued running. The path that led back to the village slowly became wider. The thick forest began to thin. Soon the tall grasses appeared, and finally the familiar sight of his village came into view. Smoke curled gently from cooking fires. Children ran between houses. Women carried clay pots filled with water. Life in the village moved peacefully, just as it always did. But Obi was not peaceful. He burst into the village square, breathing heavily. Several villagers turned to look at him. One of them laughed. "Obi, you run like a man being chased by spirits." Another man looked at his empty hunting bag. "Did the forest defeat you today?" Obi raised his hand. "Listen to me," he said loudly. The laughter slowly faded. Something in Obi's voice made the villagers pay attention. "What happened?" an older man asked. Obi looked around the crowd. Men, women, children. They were all staring at him now. "I saw something in the forest," Obi said. "What did you see?" someone asked. Obi hesitated. The words sounded strange, even in his own mind, but he spoke anyway. "I found a skull in the forest." A few villagers nodded. Finding bones in the forest was not unusual, but Obi continued. "It spoke to me." For a moment, the entire square went silent. Then suddenly, laughter exploded across the crowd. "A talking skull?" one woman laughed. "You must have been walking in the sun too long," a man joked. Another villager shook his head. "Perhaps Obi drank too much palm wine before hunting today." More laughter followed. Obi felt his face grow hot. "I am telling the truth," he insisted, but the villagers only laughed louder. Just then, an old village elder slowly stood up from where he had been sitting beneath a large tree. The elder was a man named Nana. He had lived longer than anyone else in the village. His beard was white and his back was slightly bent with age, but his eyes were sharp, very sharp. He raised his hand and the laughter slowly faded. "Let the hunter speak," Nana said calmly. The villagers grew quiet again. Nana turned toward Obi. "Tell us exactly what happened." Obi took a deep breath. "I had been hunting all morning," he began, "but I caught nothing, so I turned back toward the village. As I walked along the forest path, I saw a skull lying between the roots of a large tree. The villagers listened closely now. At first, I thought it was just a bone," Obi continued, "but when I spoke to it, it answered me." "What did it say?" a young boy asked. Obi's voice grew quieter. "It said, 'It is the mouth that killed me.'" A strange silence filled the square. Some villagers shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged doubtful glances. Nana rubbed his beard slowly. "Did the skull say anything else?" he asked. "No," Obi replied. "Only those words." One of the younger men laughed again. "This is foolishness. Skulls do not speak." Another villager nodded. "Perhaps Obi dreamed it," but Obi shook his head firmly. "I was wide awake. I heard it clearly, twice." The villagers began murmuring among themselves. Some were curious. Others were certain Obi had lost his mind. But the story spread quickly. Within minutes, people all across the village were whispering about the hunter who claimed to have found a talking skull. Eventually, the story reached the palace. The king of the village was a powerful ruler who valued truth and discipline above all things. He did not tolerate lies, and he did not enjoy having his time wasted. When the king heard the strange story, he frowned. "A skull that speaks?" he said slowly. His advisors exchanged glances. One of them spoke carefully. "Perhaps the hunter imagined it." But the king stood up. "Bring the hunter to me," he ordered. A messenger hurried to the village square. Soon, Obi was standing before the king inside the palace courtyard. The king sat on a carved wooden throne. Coral beads hung around his neck. His expression was calm, but serious. "So," the king said slowly, "I hear you have discovered something unusual in the forest." Obi bowed respectfully. "Yes, your majesty." The king leaned forward slightly. "They say you found a skull that can speak." "Yes." "And you heard it with your own ears?" "Yes, your majesty." The king studied Obi's face carefully. He wanted to see if the hunter looked like a man telling lies. "What exactly did the skull say?" the king asked. Obi swallowed. "It said, 'It is the mouth that killed me.'" The king remained silent for a moment. Then he stood up. "If what you say is true, then we will see it ourselves." He turned toward his guards. "Prepare to go to the forest." The guards nodded immediately. The king then looked back at Obi. "You will lead us to this skull." Obi felt a mixture of excitement and fear. If the skull spoke again, everyone would believe him. Perhaps the king would even reward him. But if the skull stayed silent, he pushed the thought away. The skull had spoken before. It would speak again. "I will take you there," Obi said confidently. And so the king, his guards, and many curious villagers began preparing for the journey into the forest. None of them knew that the strange skull was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The guards formed a protective line around him. Obi stood at the front, ready to lead the way. "Let us go," the king commanded. The group began walking through the village. Villagers stepped aside respectfully as the king passed. Some followed behind, curious to see what would happen. Soon they reached the edge of the village. The tall grasses swayed gently in the wind. Beyond them lay the dark forest, the same forest where Obi had heard the mysterious voice. The king stopped for a moment and looked toward the trees. The forest looked quiet, too quiet. "Lead us," the king said. Obi nodded and stepped forward. They walked through the tall grass until they reached the narrow path that led into the forest. As soon as they entered, the air changed. The forest was cooler. The sunlight became dim beneath the thick canopy of leaves. Strange sounds echoed in the distance. Birds called from high branches. Insects buzzed quietly. The villagers walking behind the guards began whispering nervously. Some of them had never gone this deep into the forest before, but Obi knew the path well. He moved confidently between the trees. The king followed closely behind, his expression calm and focused. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were footsteps and rustling leaves. Finally, one guard broke the silence. "How far is it?" he asked. "Not much farther," Obi replied. They continued walking. The deeper they went, the thicker the forest became. Sunlight barely reached the ground. Twisted tree roots spread across the path. The air smelled of damp earth and old leaves. Then suddenly, Obi stopped. The guards behind him nearly walked into him. "What is it?" one of them asked. Obi pointed ahead. "There." The king stepped forward. Everyone followed his gaze. Beneath a large, ancient tree, its massive roots twisting across the ground, something pale rested in the dirt. It was the skull. The same skull Obi had discovered earlier. For a moment, the entire group stood frozen. The skull looked harmless, just an old bone lying on the forest floor. One of the guards laughed quietly. "This is what brought us all the way here?" The king raised his hand. The guard fell silent. The king stepped closer. He looked down at the skull carefully. Then he turned to Obi. "This is the skull?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "And this is where it spoke?" "Yes." The king crossed his arms. "Then ask it again." Obi suddenly felt the weight of every eye watching him. The villagers, the guards, the advisors, even the king. They were all waiting for the skull to speak. Obi slowly stepped forward. He stood beside the twisted tree roots. The skull lay at his feet. For a moment, the forest seemed completely silent. Obi swallowed nervously. Then he spoke. "Skull." His voice echoed softly through the trees. "You spoke to me earlier." He hesitated. Then he continued. "Tell them what you told me." The villagers leaned forward. The guards tightened their grip on their spears. The king watched closely. Everyone waited. But the skull said nothing. The forest remained silent. The forest held its breath. Obi stood frozen beside the twisted roots of the ancient tree. The skull lay at his feet, pale and unmoving. Every eye was on him. The king, the guards, the villagers, waiting, listening. Obi swallowed. Then he spoke again, louder this time. "Skull, you spoke to me before." His voice echoed softly through the trees. "Tell them what you told me." Silence. Nothing. Not even the wind moved. A bird that had been calling somewhere in the distance suddenly stopped. The forest became unnaturally still. Obi felt a cold wave pass through his body. He frowned slightly. Maybe it did not hear him. He cleared his throat and tried again. Skull, speak. His voice was sharper now, more urgent. Still nothing. Behind him, a low murmur began among the villagers. Did you hear anything? No. He said it spoke. Obi's heart began to pound. No, this was wrong. It had spoken before. He knew it. He had heard it clearly. The king stepped closer. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. Each step seemed louder than the last in the heavy silence. He stopped just a few steps behind Obi. Is this your talking skull? The king asked. Obi turned slightly, his face tight with tension. Yes, your majesty. The king looked down at the skull, then back at Obi. Then why is it silent? Obi opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. What if it would not speak again? The villagers' whispers grew louder. Some of them were no longer whispering. They were murmuring openly now. I think he lied. He wanted attention. He brought the king all the way here for nothing. One of the guards shook his head. This is foolishness. Obi quickly stepped forward again. No, it spoke before. His voice cracked slightly. He pointed at the skull. I swear it did. The king raised his hand. The murmuring stopped. He looked at Obi with a calm but heavy expression. Then ask it again. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Obi turned back to the skull. This time, fear sat deep in his chest. He bent slightly, closer to the skull. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Please, speak. Nothing. Only silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. The kind that makes your own heartbeat sound too loud. Obi's breathing became uneven. Sweat formed on his forehead. His hands trembled slightly. It spoke to me, he repeated weakly. No one responded. The king's face hardened. Slowly, he straightened his back. I do not tolerate lies, he said. His voice was no longer curious. It was cold, heavy, final. Obi quickly turned around. I am not lying, your majesty. I swear on my life. The king stared at him. Be careful, hunter, he said quietly. You may be doing exactly that. The words struck Obi like a blow. I am telling the truth, Obi insisted. His voice rose again, almost desperate now. The villagers stepped back slightly. They could feel the shift. This was no longer curiosity. This was danger. One of the advisors stepped forward slowly. Your Majesty, he said carefully, perhaps the hunter imagined it. The forest can play tricks on the mind. A few guards nodded. Yes, one added, many strange sounds echo in the forest. Obi shook his head violently. No, I was not mistaken. He pointed again at the skull. It spoke clearly. It told me. He stopped. The memory rushed back. The voice. Cold. Calm. Unnatural. And what it had said. Obi's face slowly changed. The realization hit him like thunder. The skull had told him something. Something important. Something terrible. His lips parted slightly, and in a quieter voice, almost to himself, he said, It said my mouth would be the cause of my death. A ripple of unease passed through the group. The king narrowed his eyes. What did you say? Obi looked up slowly. His fear was now visible. It said my mouth would be the cause of my death. The forest seemed to grow even colder. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a guard laughed harshly. So now the skull gives prophecies. Another guard scoffed. This man is making stories. The king did not laugh. He stepped closer, very close now. So, the king said quietly, you claim a skull spoke and also gave you a warning about your death. Obi hesitated, but then he nodded. Yes, your majesty. The king stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned away slightly. When he spoke again, his voice was firm. This is enough. The air tightened. Obi's heart dropped. Your Majesty, he began, but the king raised his hand. Silence. Obi froze. The king turned back to him. If you have lied, you have wasted the time of your king and led your people into fear over nothing. Obi shook his head. I did not lie. Enough. The word cut through the forest like a blade. Even the birds remained silent. The king looked at his guards. Take him. 2 guards stepped forward immediately. They grabbed Obi by the arms. Your Majesty, please, Obi cried out. I am telling the truth. The villagers watched in shock. Some looked away. Others whispered again. But no one stepped forward. No one defended him. Obi struggled slightly. Please, just give me one more chance. It will speak. But the skull remained silent, cold, still, unmoved. The king did not look back. Bring him to the village, he said. His punishment will be decided there. The guards began to drag Obi away. His voice echoed through the forest. It spoke, I swear, it spoke. But the forest gave no answer, and the skull said nothing. As they left, the ancient tree stood quietly, its roots wrapped around the earth like secrets, and the skull remained where it was, silent, watching, waiting, as if it already knew how the story would end. The sun was already setting when they returned to the village. The sky burned orange and red, casting long shadows across the ground. Word had spread. By the time the king and his guards entered the village square, a large crowd had already gathered. Men, women, children, all waiting, all whispering. At the center of it all stood Obi. His hands were tied, his clothes were dusty, his face was filled with fear and disbelief. The same people who had once greeted him with smiles now looked at him with doubt. Some shook their heads, others avoided his eyes. The king walked forward and took his seat beneath the great tree in the village square. The elders gathered beside him. The guards pushed Obi to his knees. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. The king spoke. Obi, son of this village, he began, his voice calm but powerful. You brought us a story. Obi lifted his head slowly. I told the truth, your majesty, he said weakly. You claimed a skull spoke to you. Yes, and yet, before all of us, it remained silent. A murmur spread through the crowd. Obi's chest tightened. It spoke before, he insisted. I heard it clearly. The king's face did not change. Words are powerful, he said. They can build trust or destroy it. Obi swallowed hard. I did not lie. The king leaned forward slightly. Then explain this. Why did the skull choose silence when we arrived? Obi opened his mouth, but again no answer came. Because he did not know. Because deep down, fear had already begun to whisper the truth to him. One of the elders spoke up. Your Majesty, this matter is dangerous. If people begin to believe false stories of spirits, fear will spread in the village. Another elder nodded. Yes, Discipline must be maintained. The king raised his hand and the elders fell silent.
He looked directly at Obi. You said the skull gave you a warning. Obi's eyes trembled. Yes? What was the warning? The entire village leaned in. Even the wind seemed to pause. Obi hesitated. Something inside him told him to keep quiet, to stop talking, to say nothing more. But fear pushed him. Fear and the desperate need to be believed. So he spoke. It said, his voice shook, that my mouth would be the cause of my death. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some gasped, others shook their heads. The king sat back slowly. And yet, he said quietly, you continue to speak. The words landed heavily. Obi's heart skipped. For the first time, he truly understood. But it was too late. The king stood up. His shadow stretched long across the ground. A man who spreads fear through false words, he declared, endangers the entire village. Obi's breathing became fast. I did not lie. Please. The king's voice cut through his plea. And a man who cannot control his mouth cannot be trusted. Silence. Deep. Final. The king raised his hand. The punishment must be given. The guards stepped forward. Obi struggled now, panic taking over. No, please, I am telling the truth. The skull spoke. It spoke. But no one listened. No one moved. Even his wife, Ada, stood at the edge of the crowd, tears running down her face, but she said nothing. Obi's voice grew louder, desperate. My mouth, he muttered. The skull warned me. The realization crashed fully into him now, not like a thought, but like a truth, a terrible, unchangeable truth. His mouth, his words had brought him here, had sealed his fate. The guards held him firmly. The king turned away. He did not watch. Moments later, it was done. A heavy silence covered the village. No one spoke. No one moved. The wind blew softly through the square, carrying dust, carrying whispers, carrying the weight of what had just happened. Far away, deep in the forest, beneath the ancient tree, the skull lay where it always had been, still, silent, unmoving. But if anyone had been there, if anyone had listened closely, they might have heard it speak again, softly, calmly, as if telling its story to the wind. It was the mouth that killed me. Moral lesson. Be careful what you say. Not every truth needs to be spoken, and sometimes talking too much can lead you into danger you cannot escape. In life, wisdom is not just in speaking, but in knowing when to be silent.